Hello, everyone, and welcome. As you get logged in, you'll see a survey on your screen. If you could take a second to fill that out, that'd be great. Now is also a great time if you would like to drop into the chat where you're calling in from. We'll get started in just a moment to allow more people to get signed in. As we wait, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Madison Burnett, and I'm a BCBA. I lead our professional development program, and I'll be supporting you throughout the webinar tonight. In addition to that, I work alongside other BCBAs on our clinician-led recruitment team, and I support in the efforts in recruiting quality professionals to join our team. If you are interested in joining, please indicate so in the post-webinar survey at the end of this webinar, or you can email careers@manhattanpsychologygroup.com. I see we have a lot of people that are returning and also some that are new, calling in from all over. Wow, as far as Japan. Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to end this survey now, or this poll now, but you can feel free to keep on dropping into the chat where you're calling in from. On this next slide, you'll see a little bit more about Manhattan Psychology Group. We were established in 2011 and have continued to grow our team consisting of skilled adult and child psychologists, neuropsychologists, behavior analysts, special educators, licensed social workers, and behavior interventionists. As a team, we're committed to wraparound care, which includes our wide range of services, from mental health and testing to ABA and educational services. This holistic approach allows us to address various needs and challenges with compassion and care. We provide services to clients out of our Upper West Side and Long Island City offices, in home, school, and clinic-based settings, as well as through telehealth. Our team is committed to serving individuals, couples, and families of all ages and in diverse settings. We're also pleased to offer these free monthly webinars for parents and professionals, where we'll continue to learn and foster meaningful connections. Our vision at MPG is to create a future where individuals and their families feel supported, connected, and empowered. Our mission is to provide multidisciplinary integrated support for individuals and their families who experience mental health, behavioral, and educational challenges. Next, we will review some housekeeping information for CEUs. For those seeking CEUs for this presentation, you will need to collect the code word stated and complete the post-webinar quiz and survey. We'll post the codes on the screen and verbally say them. Once we move on, we will not be able to come back. We will send out the post-webinar quiz within the last 10 minutes of the presentation for you to get your CEUs. And any polls during this webinar are not required, but they are encouraged. We will be leaving the chat open, so please post any comments, questions you have. If it is a question for the presenter, please post that in the Q&A so we can make sure that they are seen. And now I'd love to introduce our presenter. Dr. Amanda Menser is a board-certified behavior analyst and a licensed behavior analyst in New York. She's earned a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and a Master's of Arts in Psychology from Pennsylvania State University in 2005 and 2007, respectively. While attending City University of New York, Dr. Menser earned a Master's of Arts in General Psychology from Queens College in 2010 and a Master's and Doctor of Philosophy in Psychology from the Graduate School and University Center in 2013 and in 2017, respectively. She is a graduate of the Learning Process of Behavior and Behavior Analysis subprogram in psychology and served as a member of the Organizational Behavior Management Laboratory. Dr. Menser acquired experiential learning while earning degrees. At Pennsylvania State University, Dr. Menser created performance appraisals for direct care employees at a school for learners with autism, implemented treatment procedures for children with feeding challenges at a pediatric feeding clinic, and created and implemented educational programming for learners with autism in their homes. At City University of New York, Dr. Menser conducted and presented applied research in performance feedback and postural safety using humans and experimental research with stimulus control using pigeons. As an adjunct assistant professor at Queens College, Dr. Menser served undergraduate students in the psychology department for 11 years. As a provider, parent trainer, and supervisor for the Department of Education, Dr. Menser served learners with autism and their families for over a decade. Dr. Menser uses applied behavior analysis to create and implement programs for learners with autism, train parents, and provide supervision. She values and promotes transparency and collaboration across all aspects of service provision to best serve the needs of her learners. And now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Amanda Menser.
Thank you, Madison, for the lovely introduction. Thank you, Manhattan Psychology Group, for organizing and hosting this webinar series. Big thanks to Josh, Ariel, Michelle for their phenomenal leadership across the years. And a special thanks to Madison, Lakin, and Caitlin for their guidance and support throughout the creation of this webinar. So we're going to take the first few moments together to prepare for this learning opportunity by reviewing the description and setting some intentions for this presentation, which clearly is titled Performance Feedback, a deep dive into the characteristics and effects. So the description for this presentation that all of you read, I'm sure, when signing up is as follows. Performance feedback, hereafter referred to as feedback, is a frequently recommended component of supervision, an implemented component of interventions and research published in behavioral journals. Although frequently recommended and implemented, feedback is neither consistently defined, described, or effective, nor is it a principle of behavior. So because of these discrepancies, we invite you to join us for this deep dive into feedback. So attendees, a special thank you to all of you for graciously accepting our first of many invitations. Welcome aboard. We're grateful for and appreciate your presence. Okay, so now that we're on the same boat, let's create some deeper alignment. I would like to share with you my intentions for this presentation. So during our time together, that I have the privilege and honor of sharing with you, my intentions are threefold: to share knowledge, to inspire critical thinking, and to invite self-reflection. I intend to share some knowledge about feedback that I've acquired during the last 20 plus years. I intend to inspire critical thinking about how we think about, how we talk about, and how we deliver performance feedback. And I intend to close our time together with a final invitation to reflect on how we give and how we receive performance feedback. So these are my intentions for our time together. As co-creators of this learning experience, I extend another invitation to you. I invite you to take the next 15 seconds to consider your intentions. So what are your intentions for being in this space right now? Please feel free to share them in the chat, and I'll give you 15 seconds of silence to consider them. All right, so we're at 15 seconds. Thank you for graciously accepting another invitation and actively participating. I appreciate you. So I want to acknowledge some of these intentions. Let's see here. I see a lot of people saying that they want to improve the delivery of their feedback. D is interested in learning best practices. Gaining more knowledge, says Crystal. To accept feedback graciously. Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for sharing. Now that we're in sync about the title, the description, and our intentions for being here, let's put on some gear and prepare for this dive. So this is an overview of how we'll navigate this little adventure of ours. First, an introduction to performance feedback. Then we'll review some definitions. And after that, we'll define and discuss feedback characteristics. So at that point, we'll have the basics covered. And then we'll take a moment to pause and reflect before we take our deepest dive. The deepest dive will involve reviewing the effects of feedback, analyzing exactly what mechanisms account for these effects to consider the function feedback serves. So we're all familiar with the term feedback. We have all been a provider of feedback, a recipient of feedback, and an observer of others who are providing and receiving feedback. Feedback interventions change the behavior of all kinds of people doing all kinds of things in all kinds of places. Just a couple examples of where feedback has been used as a behavior change tactic. the safe driving of short-haul truck drivers on routes near their terminals, the efficiency with which auto parts were replenished by stockers at a distribution facility, the safety behavior of a roofing crew at a building on a university campus, the correct performance by undergraduate students during a computer task in a library on a university campus. So, of course, these are just an introduction. The combinations of people or groups of people who are receiving feedback, delivering feedback, the behaviors being targeted, and the environments where people are doing things is always expanding. So clearly feedback's important. Since humanity's inception, we likely have been using it. For decades, we've been publishing about it in research journals. So from 1983 until 2013, the word feedback appears in the title of 441 journal articles across 50 behavioral journals in which humans are participants. So that is the title of the journal includes the word behavior. From 1977 until 2009, the combined findings of 3 objective reviews in the publication history of JOBM, so the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management, indicate that feedback was the most frequently implemented intervention in the journal. So to provide some data, feedback was the intervention or a component of the intervention in 65% of the studies published from 1977 until 1986, 71% of the studies published from 1987 until 1997, and 68% of the studies published from 1998 until 2009. So in addition to the frequency with which feedback is implemented, it's also a recommended component of supervision by the BACB, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. All right, so let's take our first poll. Our first of 2 polls. For feedback, for poll number 1, let's dive into your feedback styles. So when it comes to receiving feedback, which of these scenarios best represents you? A, let's get straight to the deep end. Give me the tough stuff right away. B, I'm gonna wade in slowly. Let's start with the positive before the constructive. C, I'm gonna stay on the shore. I prefer to observe others giving and receiving feedback. Or D, a free diver. You love feedback and you actively seek it out. Wow, so the results are showing that we kind of have an equal distribution between A, B, and D, and only about 9% of people are trying to stay on the shore. Wonderful. Again, thank you all for participating. Okay, so the final consensus being that B, most of you like to wade in slowly. We prefer the positive before the constructive. Okay, so as you can imagine, this was not some rigorous academic pursuit. However, developing awareness about whether you move toward or away from feedback provides you with valuable insight. So now that we've taken our first plunge into feedback by introducing it and reflecting on our preferences with respect to receiving it, let's dive a little deeper by defining it. Feedback is used in basic and applied research, yet there's no universally accepted definition for it. I think it's important to let that sink in. We're frequently implementing this intervention and recommending it but we don't have consensus about its definition. Nonetheless, defining feedback is necessary to implement it and to analyze its effects. Thus, to provide a comprehensive foundation upon which we can discuss feedback throughout this webinar, we're going to consider both an experimental and applied definition. All right, our experimental definition provided by Mangiapinello and Hemis. Feedback is defined as the presentation of an extraceptive stimulus whose parameters vary as a function of antecedent responding. Moving on to our applied definition provided by Daniels and Bailey. Feedback is information about performance that allows a person to change his or her behavior. So now that we've defined feedback, we're going to use our behavioral lens to look at the basic building blocks of the foundation that we just built to discuss feedback. All right, using our parsimonious three-term contingency, the experimental definition specifies three components. The first component, a stimulus, which is represented by the two dark blue filled circles. So this could be A, the antecedent, the C, the consequence, or both the antecedent and the consequence. The second component, a response, represented by the light blue filled circle. So this is our B, the behavior. The third component is the relation between the stimulus and response. This is represented by the green arrows. So from an operant perspective, this could be the A-B relation, the B-C relation, or the A-B and B-C relations. From a respondent perspective, this could include the AC relation. Okay, so there's our experimental. Moving on to the applied, we're going to use the same three-term contingency to analyze these building blocks to get a better foundation for how we're going to discuss feedback. So the applied definition translates experimental jargon and specifies those same three components. And so the first component, information, again, represented by the dark blue. Just like before, this could be the antecedent, the consequence, or both A and C. The second component, performance, represented by the light blue circle. This is our B for behavior. The third component, again, the relation. So this time it's a relation between information and performance, represented by those green arrows. From the operant perspective, like before, we could be considering the A-B relation, the B-C relation, or both A-B and B-C. And then from the respondent perspective, we're looking at that stimulus-stimulus association between A and C. Okay, so I chose to offer two definitions for feedback for two reasons. First, one of those definitions might be easier for some of us to conceptualize as we continue our dive. Second, by discussing how the definitions relate to the three-term contingency 2 times, perhaps we're better able to integrate another layer of what feedback is. All right, so to recap, we've introduced feedback, defined it, and now we've just considered its basic building blocks. Now we have a proper foundation to dive deeper. Before we do that, I shall share our first code word. Love is our first CEU code word. Please write down love, as this is a first word required to earn some CEUs. Everyone got it? Okay, now we're ready to dive deeper. Let's explore the characteristics of feedback. So in alignment with the technological dimension of ABA, when we implement feedback, we need to consider who or what's delivering it. We call that the source. When and how often it's delivered, we call that the frequency. The type of information that it provides, We call that its content. And there are many other characteristics. So these characteristics, they're inseparable elements of the feedback. A source has to provide it at some frequency, and the feedback has to have some kind of content. So ultimately, feedback could consist of an undefined and likely infinite number of characteristics. Similar to there being no consensus about a definition for feedback, the water gets murkier and we navigate more challenging terrain to understand feedback characteristics. So to be direct, we do not have a universally accepted term, definition, or classification system for feedback characteristics. Let's start with the term and a few rhetorical questions to inspire critical thinking. Are they characteristics? Should we call them parameters, dimensions, forms, modalities? We can find all these terms in the literature to label these elements that cannot be separated from feedback. For the sake of honoring our time commitment to get through this webinar in an agreed upon hour, and because there are a few seminal publications that use the term characteristics, we too are going to use it. So now that we've got the term, let's work through a definition. Prior to defending my major area paper, which I did in 2013, there was no definition for feedback characteristics. Although in the research, researchers typically define the characteristic they're investigating, I never found an explicit definition for feedback characteristics. So I created this one and I integrated it with both the experimental and applied definitions that we already reviewed. So feedback characteristics are permanent and inseparable features of an extraceptive stimulus, or the relation between that stimulus and an operant behavior, that comprise a feedback procedure and are distinguishable based on physical or temporal dimensions. Okay, so now we picked the term, you've got a definition. Now let's get into some examples. So for over 50 years, researchers have recommended a classification system to organize these characteristics. However, it has yet to be comprehensively proposed. So I'm going to share with you the history from 1980 when Ford shared these characteristics. I'm going to share kind of the history of an emerging classification system. So in 1980, Ford suggested clarifying who receives the feedback. For example, is it individuals or is it a group? The extent to which feedback is accessible to others. For example, is the feedback provided privately or publicly? How feedback is provided to recipients. For example, is it written, verbal, or just some mechanical device provided? The contiguous relation between behavior and feedback. For example, is it immediate or is there some delay? The schedule with which feedback is delivered. So within a minute, within a week, what's the schedule, how frequently? Okay, so those are Ford's contributions. In 81, Prue and Fairbank extended Ford's work by suggesting 2 additional characteristics be included in this classification system. So what kind of feedback is delivered? For example, does the feedback involve an individual's current performance or a group's previous performance or some standard individual? So those are some examples. The duration with which feedback is provided. Is the duration 1 minute or is it 5 minutes? So taken together, Ford and Prue and Fairbank provided this preliminary classification system such that individuals who provide feedback should consider the feedback recipient, the privacy of feedback, the medium used to deliver the feedback, the contiguity with which feedback is provided, the schedule with which feedback is provided, the content of the feedback, and its duration. Some may argue that Balcazar, Hopkins, and Suarez provided the most extensive feedback classification system and review of the literature. So in 1985, they published a meta-analysis that evaluated applications of feedback from 4 different journals: the Journal of Applied Psychology, American Academy of Management Journal, the Journal of Applied Psychology, I said that one, the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, and JOBM, the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management. Okay, so the purpose of their paper was to assess the effects of applied feedback applications, to assess the effect of each of 6 feedback characteristics, and to assess feedback combinations. So in the next section of this presentation, we'll address the first purpose, feedback effects. In the last section of the presentation, we're going to address their third purpose, feedback combinations. And right now, we're going to continue with their second purpose, those feedback characteristics. So just like we did with Ford and Prue and Fairbank, we're going to go through the characteristics that Balcazar et al. Considered. So the individual or device presenting the information, for example, is it a supervisor? Is it feedback provided by subordinates, researchers? Is it self-generated? Are customers providing the feedback, or is some mechanical device providing it? How widely feedback was made available. Again, this showed up before. We've got public, private, or perhaps both. Feedback was displayed in both public and private ways. The people whose performance was described, is that individual performance? Is that group performance? Or is it both, individual and group performance? The type of information provided, is it individual performance, group performance, individual and group? Is it standard individual performance or standard group performance? The means used to communicate the feedback. So was it verbal, written, mechanical, graphic, or some combination of those, like verbal and graphic, or mechanical and verbal, or written and graphic? And our last one here, how often feedback was provided. Daily, weekly, monthly, maybe daily and weekly, so some combination of those. All right, so Balcazar et al.'s review of performance feedback evaluated the following 6 characteristics of feedback: the source of feedback, the privacy of feedback, the participants whose performance was described, the content of the feedback, the mechanisms used to communicate the feedback, and the frequency with which feedback is provided. Okay, so let's take all that together. This slide organizes all the feedback characteristics that we just talked about from those 3 seminal publications. So in this first column, the first 5 characteristics are those Ford proposed, with the latter 2 being from Prue and Fairbank. In the second column, these are the characteristics provided by Balcazar et al. And so the feedback characteristics in both columns are organized such that the rows are the same characteristics, even though researchers labeled them differently. So for example, recipient and participants are labeled differently and defined similarly. The same goes for medium and mechanism, and schedule and frequency. The blue highlights, they represent characteristics that were not identified or analyzed in their respective publication. So for example, the bottom of the first column, the blue highlight at the bottom of the first column, Prue and Fairbank didn't consider a source of feedback in their classification. And then in that second column, Balcazar et al., they didn't consider contiguity or duration when they provided their classification system. So putting all those together, this third column summarizes the feedback characteristics. So those 3 seminal classification publications that we reviewed, from those, we have these 8 feedback characteristics: participants, privacy, mechanism, contiguity, frequency, content, duration, and source. Okay, so now that I've shared with you some examples of feedback characteristics, or offered a reminder of what you already know, I'm going to extend another invitation. So in the next 15 seconds, I would like you to think critically about novel feedback characteristics. So these were the forefathers kind of creating the foundation. What other inseparable aspects of feedback can you think about? Consider your role as a supervisor, a coworker, a parent, a friend. What other feedback characteristics would you include when delivering performance feedback? Or would you appreciate a source to include when you receive the feedback? Excellent. So I'm going to give you 15 seconds of silence. And again, feel free to share in the chat. Amazing. Thank you all again for accepting another invitation and sharing. Rapport is one that I see show up a lot. Building relationships is so important. Mood, respect, tone, I've seen a few times. Beautiful. Thank you all for sharing. I love it. They're still coming. Awesome. Okay, so in the literature, researchers are investigating combinations, immediacy, nature, specificity, correctness, accuracy, ratio, sandwich, temporal location, and modality. So I'm going to go through each of these, kind of hesitating at this first one, because if you remember, our definition for feedback characteristics are inseparable aspects of the feedback. And so combinations, that's actually one that shows up with Balcazar et al. They don't consider it a feedback characteristic. And then we'll talk about some direct replications to Balcazar et al. They also include combination. So combination has to do whether additional components are added to the feedback. So is it feedback only? Or has it been combined with an antecedent? Has it been combined with some other consequence? Is there goal setting involved? So feedback combination has to do with whether there are additional components. And so this is one that, is it a characteristic or not? Up for debate. Immediacy, this showed up with contiguity, but again, I'm just highlighting how across publications, across researchers, the same characteristics are being called different things. So immediacy, how quickly the feedback is provided after a target behavior occurs. Some researchers considered nature, the nature of the feedback, and they defined it as, was the feedback given on wanted or unwanted behavior? specificity, the precision with which the source of feedback provides information. So this shows up with a couple different researchers, and they're generally classifying specificity as specific versus overall, or specific versus global information. Correctness, accuracy, some fascinating findings here. So the extent to which feedback provided reflects true performance. And you're going to come across a few articles whereby inaccurate feedback actually produces changes in behavior, improvements. So that's a fascinating finding, that the feedback doesn't have to be accurate to improve performance. Ratio sandwich. So these are two different labels for a similar characteristic. With a ratio, we're looking at a proportional relation between two or more classes of feedback. That sandwich would be an example of one. So if you've ever heard of a feedback sandwich, it was talked about long ago, like, don't do that. However, there wasn't research until recently. But that has to do with providing positive, then a corrective, and then a positive feedback statement. So temporal location, this has to do with when feedback is delivered in the three-term contingency. So there are some people providing feedback before behavior, and some people provide it after. Feedback modality. So this characteristic seems to be a blend of the source of feedback and the mechanism of feedback. So these particular researchers looked at different conditions: computer delivered feedback, a text message on a phone, and then a face-to-face conversation. And I put ... as you can imagine, because this is not an exhaustive list. So initially we discussed 8 from those seminal articles. Now we've got 8 more. And for those sharing in the chat, you see that there are many, many more characteristics of feedback. And as a little caveat, I'm kind of going to make this side note. Within each of these, I tried to provide examples of each character. Like, there's the characteristic, and then there are these elements within the characteristic. So for example, the source of feedback. Examples would be researcher, or coworker, or subordinate, or there are all these different examples of that characteristic. What you guys alluded to in the chat, I think, is worth mentioning. So say the source of feedback, say we're going to talk about our boss, our manager. There are characteristics within the manager then, the extent to which we have rapport with them, their integrity. So we can keep getting more analytic about these. So I'm just kind of highlighting the challenge of saying matter of fact that a specific characteristic could be responsible for the change in behavior. Okay, we'll circle back to that a little later. For now, we're on to our second poll. So this is our last of 2 polls. So for this one, we're going to explore your perception of which feedback characteristic has the biggest effect, biggest impact. So which of the following characteristics do you believe is most important when receiving feedback? Is it A, the source, B, the frequency, C, the content of the feedback, or D, the mechanism, the means used to communicate it? Amazing. Technology is so cool that I can see this stuff in real time. So we're kind of slowing down. So I'm going to end this poll and I'll share with you the results. So of the 299 people who responded, 21% suspect source, 12% frequency, 51% of you believe that the content of the feedback is most important. And then 17% chose mechanism. Awesome. So thanks again for participating. And so like that last poll that we had, this is not a rigorous academic pursuit. And I don't even have answers for you, actually. As far as I know, studies of this sort had never been conducted. So for those of you in need, this could be a fantastic dissertation pursuit, a component analysis of which feedback characteristics are most important. Thank you all for participating. Yeah, it's absolutely subjective. Okay, so let's take a moment and pause and reflect on what we've discussed so far. We introduced performance feedback and defined it. We did the same for feedback characteristics. And we reviewed over 15 different, including you guys, over 20 different characteristics of feedback. So we've covered the basics. So now we're ready for a deep dive, the deepest dive. And although we won't be able to stay down there too long, given that our tanks are running out of air, what I mean is we actually have probably about 8 minutes left to leave some time for questions. But what we're going to do here at the end, we're going to review the effects of feedback. We'll analyze exactly what mechanisms may account for those effects, and then we'll close the presentation. All right. Although it would be awesome, as you can imagine, you might be able to pick up that I get really excited talking about this stuff. It would be awesome to review the effectiveness of each feedback characteristics, and these 3 reviews provide us with those data, but we don't have time to go through each of them. So we're just going to go through quickly and review the overall effectiveness of feedback across these 3 meta-analyses. If you're interested in a performance feedback version 2, let us know. Maybe that's something we could think about. Okay, so to provide you with the most comprehensive understanding of feedback effects, we're going to review these 3 meta-analyses from each article is from JOBM, Journal of Organizational Behavior Management. So we're going to start with the left. We'll go through Balcazar, Hopkins, and Suarez, and then we'll consider Alvaro, Buckland, and Austin's meta-analysis. And then in the end, we'll look through Slyman et al. Slayman et al.? All right, so this is a table that's going to help us move through it. So as we review the effects of feedback, each application of feedback will be classified as either having consistent effects, mixed effects, no effects, or unknown effects. And so to give you a quick operational definition for each of those, consistent effects, that means that the feedback uniformly produced desired mean increases or decreases relative to baseline conditions or control groups, or other independent variable conditions or groups for all subjects, settings, and behaviors. Mixed effects means that feedback produced desired mean increases or decreases relative to baseline conditions or control groups, or other independent variable conditions or groups for some, but not all, subject settings and or behaviors. No effects means that performance levels during baseline or control conditions or groups were the same for the feedback conditions or groups. And then unknown, you'll see that Balcazar et al. And Alvaro et al. Have some unknown effects. And that simply means that the baseline conditions or the control groups involve 2 or fewer data points that don't really permit any kind of comparison. All right, so we got the basics now. Let's get into the data. So we're going to look at Balcazar et al. First. So of the 114 feedback applications that they analyzed, 47 of them produced consistent effects, which means 41%. 56 of them produced mixed effects, thus 49%. 11 of them produced no effects, thus 10%. And so you can see here, it gets a little confusing because these unknown, now our denominator, the number of feedback applications analyzed jumps up to 126. These 12 unknown were not accounted for in the consistent mix and no effects. So that's why things are a little different. But there were 12 feedback applications in their review that didn't even provide this information. A fascinating reality. So then we move on to Alvaro, Buckland, and Austin. And so of the 64 feedback applications that they analyzed, 37 of them produced consistent effects, which is 58%. 26% of them produced mixed effects, and one produced no effects. So again, just like Balcazar et al., we've got 4 feedback applications in their review that didn't have proper comparisons. So conclusive results couldn't have been made there. All right, so for this last meta-analysis, let's see. So Slayman et al. Of the 90, so their design, it's actually, so from Balcazar to Alvaro, these were nearly direct replications. The way that this most recent publication, 2020, came out, their data are a bit different because they analyzed effect size when the others just did visual analysis of the data. And so I'm kind of stretching it by making these comparisons, but for the sake of providing you with data and information, we're going to include them. So of the 96 feedback applications that they analyzed, we're going to say 78% of them produce consistent effects, thus 81%. And so to break that down to the effect sizes that you'll find in their article, effect sizes larger than 0.8, there were 59 of those, and effect sizes at 0.6 or larger, there were 19. So I combined those two groups as they did too when they were comparing to previous research. So the 59 and 19 takes us to the 78. 78 feedback applications involve consistent effects. And then 11 of them produce mixed effects, that meaning that the effect size was 0.59, from 0.59, from 0.2 to 0.59. And then the no effects, the effect size of less than 0.2. And there were no applications that had unknown effects. Okay, so taking all this together. So when definitions for feedback, terms for feedback characteristics, when both of these things vary across publication and there's no comprehensive classification system, it's not surprising that feedback can get some criticism because there's so much ambiguity around things. But these meta-analyses indicate that the effectiveness of feedback is increasing across time. And it also suggests that we as a field are improving our technological descriptions of feedback. So feedback interventions are being described well enough to promote replicability. All right, so as we step into this last section, and I'm tapping into question time here, so I'm going to go super quick. So in addition to understanding the effects of feedback, researchers are motivated to understand what mechanisms account for those effects to determine exactly what function feedback serves. So researchers have suggested that feedback serves many or multiple functions, and discussions regarding the behavioral principles underlying those effects are limited. So let's see here. Mangiapinello and Hemis, I see it's getting dark in here, I'm just turning a light on. So Mangiapinello and Hemis provide what I consider the most outstanding behavior analytic interpretation of feedback. So in these next three slides, I'm just gonna quickly review nearly a direct outline from headers in their articles. And my hope is that by introducing these main topics, I'm gonna inspire you guys to take a deep dive independently to read that article in its entirety. And so after they kind of introduce feedback, then they compare feedback with reinforcement and punishment procedures. And so, yeah, so this is kind of looking at the B-C relation. They also consider the AC relation. So this section specifically is looking at consequential control. They do so, they look at a priori establishment of behavior altering effects of consequential stimuli, the parameters of consequence delivery, delay of consequence for responding, the probability of consequence delivery, and the precision of the relation between responding and consequences. They conclude that there are similarities between feedback procedures and those of typical operant procedures for all of these categories except for that middle one, the delay of consequence for responding. So what they found is that in the typical learning literature, there's actually a consistent inverse relation between delay and learning, such that the more contiguous, the faster learning, the more delayed, the slower learning, but that's not found with feedback procedures. So that was the only one that was different there. So moving on to these antecedent stimulus control. So there could be consequential control. So feedback could serve the function of reinforcers or punishers. Feedback could also serve the function of antecedents. So in this section, they look at feedback and discriminative control, feedback and instructional control, and feedback and motivating operations. And they conclude that it's theoretically plausible that feedback can exert antecedent control and serve a discriminative, instructional, or motivating function. And this is kind of their summary and implications. Clearly, the argument is still limited because their paper was a review. There weren't empirical studies in which functional relations are directly compared. Nonetheless, we propose that strength of the convergent data presented here supports the conceptually systematic assertion that feedback phenomena are reducible to operant conditioning. And so in conclusion, discussing feedback in terms of operant conditioning procedures offers a more parsimonious means for its technological, analytic, and conceptually systematic advancement than entertaining previous notions that researchers have offered that feedback is a physical stimulus, is a class of stimuli, or is a principle of behavior. Okay, so then we've got our second code word. This is the last code word that you'll need to get continuing ed credits. Discipline. All right. So now we're going to close. And as we close, I want to take this opportunity to kind of circle back to where we started. So my intentions were to share knowledge, to inspire critical thinking. And I tried my best. I did my best. And I hope you learned something. I hope you learned something and thought critically. So for this final intention, I want to extend a few more invitations for self-reflection. So the next time you receive feedback, I invite you to reflect on which feedback characteristics were valuable and meaningful to you, and also to embody humility when receiving feedback. And the next time you provide feedback, I invite you to request feedback from the person who received your feedback and to embody kindness and compassion when you're delivering the feedback. Learn what feedback characteristics are helpful, valuable, and meaningful to those who you serve. And so, what were your intentions for being in this space? I also hope that they were fulfilled.
Thank you, Amanda. If everybody has probably been seeing some of my updates in the chat, I have sent the link for the CEU quiz as well. If you have any questions, unfortunately, we are not able to go back and repeat a code word. So we are unable to repeat it, but this was recorded, so we'll be posting it on our website within the next 2 weeks or so. So you can rewatch it, and then you can take the CE quiz from there. If this is your first time attending one of our webinars, you will be prompted to create a new Thinkific account. If you're a returning guest, make sure you use the login email that you initially signed up with. But overall, if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out to professional development at manhattanpsychologygroup.com. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you everyone for attending tonight's webinar. If you guys did have any other questions, oh, I'm sorry, I do see more questions in the Q&A. Amanda, do you see, we
I don't
have,
even know where the Q&A is. I've got a
okay, I'd be
poll, I've
happy to
got a
read them.
chat. Okay.
So the first question is, could the component analysis of what impacts this individual strongest or what is most important to the individual be mediated by and affected by personality?
Yeah, definitely. I'm a little unclear, like personality of the source, personality of the recipient. Regardless, I think that's going to be a variable of consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, another question is from the Sleeman et al. Study. The percentage doesn't add up to 100%. Is there an exclamation for the remaining 1%?
So this might have just been a rounding situation on my part. They did it to 2 decimal places, but I kind of just dropped those. So if it was under 0.5, I cut that off. So yeah, if I would have done 2 decimal places, perhaps you would have gotten to that 100%.
No worries. Okay, and then I did see a couple coming through the chat that kind of got a little bit buried. Is feedback paired with other consequences?
Yeah, absolutely. Across time, people have paired it with so many different things.
Okay, and then we just got a couple more in. Earlier in the presentation, an article was labeled as Menser et al. 2023, but is not listed in the references. Would that citation be noted or the title of the article to aid searching? So how can they find that article?
Oh, 2023, I think that might be a typo. So there are 2 of mine, 2013.
Uh,
So the effects of parametrically manipulating the ratio, that is available as like a dissertation.
okay.
But the other one is unpublished. But if someone personally wants it, I'm happy to share.
Okay.
Um,
Matthew,
yeah.
if you would like to reach out, I'd be happy to connect you on with Amanda. All right. And then the last one that got sent in through the chat was, can you explain consistent again? This was from slide 34.
Go back there. Consistent effects. So that just simply meant that the effects were observed across all, depending on the particular study, but the effects of feedback were found for everything studied, meaning across people, places, environments.
Okay, well, that I think is all the questions for you, Amanda. Thank you so much. It was such a great webinar and very informative, and I think everybody really appreciated it. So thank you again.
Yeah, thanks so much. I had
Of
a lovely
course,
time.
of
Thank
course.
you
I'm
all
going,
for being here.
yeah, it was great.